Earth Day's 2025 theme is Our Power, Our Planet, calling for everyone to unite around renewable energy with the aim of tripling clean electricity by 2030. To mark Earth Day 2025, we speak with two Filipino millennial sustainability practitioners, both with full-time jobs in securities and finance, and ask what they're doing on climate action in the face of anti-decarbonization sentiment in the U.S. Please welcome Nisha Alicer, equities analyst at DA Market Securities by day, and by way of advocacy, Climate First Country Coordinator and Consultant. And with her is fellow collaborator Jonas Dumdum, Senior Consultant at the Nomura Research Institute, Singapore, Manila branch. So good to have you both. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you
for having us. And on Earth Day.
Thank you for having us, Cathy.
And just for the record, we are speaking on Earth Day itself, April 22nd, also the day after Pope Francis passed on, a big climate advocate with Laudato Si'. He's the first among popes to write about the environment. How important has his presence been in your advocacy and climate action? Jonas.
Honestly, with the release of Laudato Si', you had communities all of a sudden open themselves into the idea that they are also stewards for the environment, especially in Catholic majority Philippines, where we're always thinking about how do we improve local communities, how do we empower ourselves to take care of the things that we see around us. And the encyclical has opened the conversation for these communities to engage with the various stakeholders that they would need to talk to and see, okay, how can we improve ourselves, how we can improve our own local communities by improving the environment. We've never had that conversation before Laudato Si', as far as I can remember. But even now, now that it was published in 2015, it's already 10 years, a lot of communities point to Laudato Si' as their kind of like their North Star, if for the lack of a better term, to engage and put that religious or put faith in their belief that we have our own home to protect, and God can only do so much.
And also put it into context, because that was 2015, the time that Typhoon Yolanda leveled Leyte, where you're from.
Right, yes.
And a couple of months after, COP21 had their Paris Agreement, a landmark agreement. So that must have been really big from your perspective, being an advocate.
Right, so Pope Francis came by to Leyte, visited the communities that were
yellow cave. Can't forget that. Yes, the rains just started pouring, and then the winds.
Yeah, he braved it.
Like
there was a typhoon at the time. And then people braved to see him. He braved also. And it was such an important moment for everyone, I think, because the people were still trying to recover, and even years later. So it was such an impactful moment to recognize that climate change is real, it's here, and it's affecting vulnerable communities in the Philippines. We're one of the most vulnerable in the world. And so it's very important to kind of remember that call for climate action. And beginning with the church, the communities that the church can engage with could be a very powerful thing to work with, to be able to raise awareness and inspire climate action.
I've heard communities many, many times over, and just that one answer from you both, the importance of communities when we talk about climate advocacy. But we also talk about climate as an activism. But there is a difference that you wish to cite that creates a bigger conversation and something that is more applicable, maybe even more inclusive and also acceptable to all.
Well, maybe Nisha, you'd like to start us off on that one.
So coming from a grassroots kind of base. I've met different people across sectors that represent businesses, governments, activists, and civil society, NGOs, and they really have very different perspectives. And what I do see is that sustainability practitioners, people like us in the space, are able to kind of bridge differences in opinions and differences in types of solutions that we can come at to be able to address it together, to be able to have impactful solutions, effective solutions. So, for example, working with the government, not all livelihood programs are able to survive over the years. And so we talk about how we can bring them together to real dialogue, to have kind of a baseline understanding of what climate science is, and to also be able to have ownership over solutions, strategies that we can put to the table. Yeah.
And in businesses, it's also trying to get them to think about what are the perspectives that are out there that can be more inclusive to them. The conversations when it comes to activism can scare off a few people, saying that it might be too extreme. So we would prefer the term advocacy rather, or compared to activism, because it brings more people together. It opens the door for anyone who has an opinion on certain things for a particular business to come in and say, oh, this is what we see, this is what we want the company to work with us on.
Yeah, especially if you speak about businesses, and in particular, you watch businesses as they are publicly listed companies. I noticed that you've already engaged the concept of sustainability in your stock picks.
Mm-hmm.
You've already gone that path.
Right.
How were you able to draw now which company does something good for the environment and which one does not?
Sure.
And then make a stand for it as an equity analyst?
It was quite a journey. So it was really nice because, as an equities analyst, I'm trained to look at margins and revenues and growth. But it was also through the market that I was able to understand, the economics of poverty, the problems of a naturally rich country, but also that companies were actually starting to report as early as 2015. So these were very interesting stocks to me because it taught me about how they were approaching sustainability and how early on they were at being able to start their sustainability journey, see their progress. So from sustainability reports, I went into reading integrated reporting, and it was really interesting to me because it was such a learning process, and at the same time able to connect the fact that these companies are de-risking better than the other companies that aren't thinking about sustainability. And so they're actually able to future-proof their businesses better. And that, to me, as an equities analyst, is actually a very rational choice to make, to be able to invest in companies that really think about long-term growth as opposed to just the next quarter.
Did you see it that way yourself, Jonas, being at the Nomura Research Institute?
Well, over the years, what I've seen in businesses is that what they want to have is the idea of a long-term value, that they're there for the next 30, 50, 100 years. So how do you ensure that happens? You really have to look at, okay, not just your financial bottom line, but also your impacts to things that you thought would be something it's outside your control, but actually you do have some degree of control. And that means looking into environmental and social issues that impact the company, both in looking inward and looking outward, and see how that would create long-term value to ensure that the company will be there for the long term.
Yeah. And beyond finances, to account for impact, negative externalities on the environment, on society. Jonas also reminded me about an important word, intergenerational kind of flourishing of a company and also people.
Legacy companies living out more years because they're sustainable, which brings us to the conversation of customers, to the young, the people they serve. In particular, for all that we've talked about, we haven't really talked about the public here. But when I came to this conversation, my team was asking me, We just want to know one thing because it's Earth Month. Gaano ba ka talaga ka-Earth conscious or sustainability driven ang Pilipinas compared to other countries?
If you look at it from a historical perspective, the Filipino is actually conscious of the environment prior to rapid globalization and modernization. The issues that some say that the issues that we're experiencing today was actually born out of the modernization that we had in the 1980s, where it also we did have all of this modern developments coming in, but it also increased inequality and poverty. And that's why there were solutions that were brought about to address these problems of financial inequality, such as sachets. Right? Sachets didn't really come into the Philippine setting until like the 1980s, according to some historical texts. So we thought it was really more of convenience and more affordability, but in the long term, we now have a plastic pollution crisis here in the Philippines. We also thought that the things are very efficient enough for us, but in the long term, it actually contributed to environmental issues that we're now facing today. That can range from deforestation all the way to climate change. So that we didn't see that before, but now we're trying to address it. So
who's trying to address it? I mean, we learned it backwards.
Yeah.
Oops, using too much sachet, we didn't know how to dispose them. Is it the companies, the government, the people?
actually, it's a conversation that has to be done by everyone.
So it hasn't happened.
It's happening now. We're seeing progress actually now. I mean, if you think about it, like 5 years ago, you wouldn't probably bring a tumbler to the office. Now you are like just have water dispensers. That's it. So that's one major difference that we're seeing. That may be subtle, but actually can go a long way. So yeah. So if we have that, we also are having these conversations moving forward to address these issues that we have now.
And you've been pointing him to the right direction. Young learners, you've been asking him to hold these talks with the young folks, and in particular, graduate students.
Right. So I'm part of a program, development management, and it was very interesting to find that these are really young professionals, like happy to work on climate action and eager to learn. And so while there is that passion and advocacy, what I found was perfect was that Jonas could bring in, that aspect of bridging policy and science and business together to explain how it works in the real world. And so like at this point, if they're able to embed sustainability in the way they think, in the way they do work, then that would create, a multiplier effect in terms of impact.
And what did you discover amongst those you spoke with? Were they able to connect greenhouse gas emissions with revenues, bottom line?
Yeah, it was actually a very interesting conversation. We were talking about, the initial idea was actually just to talk about how do you account for your carbon footprint.
So you did the maths there.
Yeah, we
like,
did the math.
How much do you fly?
That kind of thing. But I told Nisha, no, that's quite simple enough. The actions before you get to the calculations and the actions after you do the calculations are more important. So we transformed that conversation into, okay, why are we doing this in the first place? What are the things that we need to look at? And then we do the calculation. Then the next question would be, how do you solve these issues? Because in the end, it's a story. It's a narrative that you need to look at and see, okay, we have this problem, what's the solution?
Yeah.
And was it effective? I mean, did they bite into it? Were instant climate advocates? I'm not flying anymore.
I mean, I think they're more conscious enough to say, okay, we now have this problem. What are the possible choices that we can make? If we can avoid making those choices that are heavy in emissions, great. If there's like a good alternative, for example, in renewable energy, then we go to that and then really focus on that and see how it can lead to in solving that problem.
Yeah, it led to a lot of problem solving. For example, we looked at the sector of hospitality, in particular hotels, and how do you account for all of the emissions. And it also led us to understand. So one of the participants is Raf Janisha of Mad Travel, and they run a hostel in La Union. And we started talking about, okay, so what's the concern with water? And apparently in their community, they don't have good access to water, and they have to pay high prices to be able to access water. And so suddenly you're not just talking about your own business, but you might actually be looking for solutions for the whole community. And beyond the idea of having good hospitality businesses, it's also thinking about how does tourism affect the rest of the community? Does it make it still affordable for the community to live in their home, as opposed to tourists who come in and will bring in revenues for your business?
It's all interconnected. Again, that concept of community, which brings us to the world order, or the disruption that's going on right now. Because apart from Liberation Day, President Trump has his anti-decarbonization initiatives set on since he started his office. Second term in office, calling climate crisis a hoax and dismissed those concerned by its worsening impacts as climate lunatics. How do you work with that when the world's biggest economy and one of the largest emitters starts to say no to initiatives in climate change?
So that's really devastating for us. We know that the Biden administration had established NDCs to bring down emissions from 2005 levels by 66%. And at the same time, putting in the tariffs that make prices less competitive, or that the US pulling funding from research, from mitigation adaptation projects, and from communities that are vulnerable to climate change. And so that's truly something that we really need to face head on. As the Philippines, as part of the Global South, which is taking in 80% of the risk of climate change, whereas compared to the Global North, which is responsible for 70% of historical emissions, we really need to actually be the leaders in sustainability because we feel it viscerally.
Well, in terms of global impacts, it's not just the U.S. that's driving the conversations on decarbonization. Sure, the United States is considered the largest emitter of the second largest, actually. China is number one. But when we talk about decarbonization, we look to other countries as well for guidance. For example, the most active right now in this conversation would be the European Union. And they've adopted directives to combat climate change and then get other people, or get their partners from basically the supply chain to go along with it. So although anti-decarbonization is on the rise, but I don't think it will severely impact in the long term, because companies will definitely need to see how they are resilient to issues related to climate change, and how do they need to address that.
But as to the EU, they are indeed addressing and working towards decarbonization, but there are some signs that they may be wavering on the 2040 targets.
Yeah.
So that isn't helpful.
To be fair, at the moment, yes, it looks like it's going to be that way. But if you look at the directives themselves, even if there's going to be like a slowdown, but they're still going to be in place. And although companies will probably scale back, and I think it's really more of also like an impact to Trump's decarbonization efforts. They're also looking at it that in a way that they will still address climate change, but have to navigate through the current political realities. Eventually, they'll probably go back and say, okay, we need to focus on this now because we want to look at it on a more long-term perspective.
And even more so when you're in a country that's really gets wiped out whenever a typhoon
Mm.
comes along, and there are at least 20 typhoons just in the Philippines
Mm.
alone. And you talked about Global South taking the lead.
Mm.
But where do we get the funding?
That is a good question, Cathy. I think the opportunity here is that Southeast Asia, for example, can be a supply chain hub, a new supply chain hub, considering the changes and really the tariffs that have been put on China and Vietnam. And so I think, and as Jonas pointed out when we were chatting about this, is that we learned from the pandemic. There has to be a diversification, and that would actually just work better, really, for businesses in general. So yeah, I think diversification is important, and I think though, to Jonas's point, that longer term we are not worried about the tariffs that Trump has put in or the pulling of funding. But in terms of funding, there have been moves by multilateral agencies to kind of reimagine collaboration. So, for example, ADB was talking about how they want to change the way they approach things. For example, food sovereignty or blue economy. They want to be able to engage other stakeholders, be more collaborative. So again, going back to community, grassroots, empowering them, really encouraging active agency, I think is would really be useful for so many things beyond climate change, but also really addressing wicked problems that we have.
Well, supply chain is a wicked problem when you talk about tariffs. And some of the experts out there are saying because of the supply chain issue, the green initiatives in the US, all green, clean technology initiatives have been shut.
Mhm.
So what happens now? I mean, in your own analysis, how will renewable energy flourish if supply chains for clean technology get cut off in the US? Where is it going to go? And how is it going to benefit us?
Right. Well, Jonas has pointed out our prices are still very competitive in terms of renewable energy. So costs to building renewable energy projects have gone down 80% over the last decade. And so it's still the source of very affordable energy, at least in the Philippines.
Yeah. Well, if you look at it from a price perspective, a lot of renewable energy experts will tell you that, let's say, solar is around will generate around 350 450 per kilowatt hour, compared to, let's say, your traditional sources of fuel that can go up to 9 pesos. And if that's the case, then you have that idea. Okay, we should really go to more cheaper sources of electricity, such as solar. But of course, we also have to balance the idea that the Philippines runs into like the national grid. You know, you can't really sustain all solar or wind, all renewable. So there's also a conversation about balance, right? How do you stabilize the grid, knowing that these sources are disruptive and not like continuous, like what you would see in a coal power plant or an oil power plant. So again, decisions have to be made on how to make that shift to low carbon economy or low carbon energy generation in the Philippines, which is being done. I mean, the government also has already committed to at least 50% renewables by 2040 in their latest Philippine Energy Plan. So with that kind of commitment, companies are incentivized to make that shift eventually and make sure that the target is met.
But that was before oil and gas prices tanked
Mhm.
because of the tariff concern leading to global recession. So it's now easier to pollute, and it's more difficult to greenlight those clean technologies. So how do you make the justification then that narrative still stands? That it's so much more cheaper to do renewables when you've got oil and gas prices at record lows?
I think it's also going to be driven by consumer perceptions. I mean, if you recall the news articles at the very start of the pandemic, where we saw clear skies.
Oh yeah, I
over
love those. I
Metro
miss those.
And people were saying, "Oh, why can't we have that every day?"
We just have to work from home.
Yeah, we just have to work from home. No, but the energy generation or electricity generation in the Philippines actually constitutes around 40% of total emissions in the Philippines, based on data that I got way back. I think it was 2022, 23, and it's going to be the although we have renewable energy set around 20%, 22% if I recall, that's hopeful that we would be expecting that there will be an increase in the share in the future, simply because there are incentives to do so here in the Philippines to shift to renewable energy. Take the programs of the Department of Energy and also the collaboration that's being done both with government and private sector on these issues will definitely still drive that conversation towards renewables and eventually steer away from what we call traditional energy sources.
But Trump's point of anti-decarbonization did raise a valid point. Is climate change real?
Most definitely. IPCC has declared it, a fact, and to go against it would be abandonment of our responsibility towards
Are there
the
many
planet.
turners since his return to office here in the Philippines? Are you finding that there are those who probably got convinced by
So,
his view?
in the US, I think there was an increase among Republicans of skepticism, but just by 8 to 10%. But in the Philippines, we found a study done by Alibaba. So we're a consumer country. And in fact, 70+% of Filipinos are open to knowing more about sustainability, how to live a more sustainable life. Of course, convenience and affordability are the challenge. And so we think that's where businesses can come in and bridge that gap. There is available sustainable financing, more and more now, and different kinds. And so we think that at least that support is there for companies. So for example, there are property companies that are going low carbon emission. And of course, renewable energy is one of the first projects really to have been funded by multilateral agencies.
And to keep them in check, with sustainability reporting getting an update in 2026, you did mention there are companies who already have done and started on sustainability reporting, but right now there's a second step there in 2026. But how prepared are the publicly listed companies in the Philippines?
I think since they've had this experience in reporting sustainability related impacts in when the regulations first came out in 2019, they're more prepared now than when we all started. Like, we're not starting from scratch anyway. The major improvements, though, are the integration of more standards and really binding the story between your financial impacts and your non-financial impacts. And you also need to engage with your suppliers more. I think that's the biggest change that I see in the change in regulation, in the updates. So you now have, before it was just the company itself, but now it's the company and the people and the suppliers that support you, the partners that support you. That really also drives the conversation for those companies to decarbonize or to be more environmentally aware.
Knowing your suppliers and the changes that will probably happen with the new suppliers coming in, leading us to the issue over data collection, because that's so important in sustainability reporting. So how do we track and trace now with how messed up this is going to be in terms of a supply chain, and not be accused probably of greenwashing?
So a lot of companies are already starting to digitalize their data collection. There are already companies in the Philippines that are supporting these firms that are mandated to do sustainability reporting to have an efficient count of their data. Before, I remember in 2020, when the first reports came out, it was all Microsoft Excel. But now it's now web-based. It's driven by it's all in the net, basically. In the future, we're also expecting AI to come into the conversation and see how decisions would be made in the future. So data collection is heading in a way that will be more accurate and more consistent with what the standards are out there.
And just to add to from a grassroots perspective, so we do food mapping, cultural mapping, and these are so important to be able to preserve cultural heritage, natural heritage, because the more we know about them from a certain baseline year, we are able to track if they're still around in the next years and how they're growing, how we can improve productivity, let's say, for example, for a certain crop that exists just in Palo Leyte, let's for example, or the Leyte region. And yeah, so mapping and having all of that data is such a crucial foundational thing to start with for anyone willing to wanting to work in the space.
And then the regulators will have to manage the reporting that goes through, making sure that they're honest, they're transparent. So how do they do that then from a regulatory perspective with businesses needing to stay aligned and make sure they're telling the truth?
Actually, the SEC is only one of many players when it comes to the idea of making sure that the data really corresponds to what the company is visibly doing on the ground. The idea of effective stakeholder management gets involved in addressing these concerns. So if there's a particular stakeholder that would look into a particular part of the report and say, that doesn't look right. So they do have that voice to go to that company and say, look, are you sure that this is really, really accurate? So and then we're now seeing the openness of a lot of companies, mostly the biggest ones, because they're the ones that are more open to this. But eventually, all the publicly listed companies would be open to this. And then, because of that idea that the value chain gets involved, the suppliers get involved. The suppliers are also becoming more, or would become more conscious about what data they're going to put out there, because it will eventually lead to decisions whether or not, should we really continue to work with you because you're aware of your environmental impacts and social impacts, and we can definitely work with you. You're aligned with what we want, or should just go to somewhere else.
But regulators, I mean, are they engaging sustainability practitioners as yourself?
Actually, yes. I think around 2 months ago, the SEC had a conversation on how to effectively include more, insights on the KPIs or the metrics that they're doing, to accurately reflect what's the reality on the ground.
Yeah, and the PSC, for example, has done a lot of initiatives in terms of partnering up with different organizations to make sure that standards are there, global standards are there, they're updated, and that they're engaging with other countries, other economies, other organizations to be able to have harmonized regulations, to be able to speak to each other when it comes to financial markets wanting to trade together.
And they consult you as a sustainability practitioner?
Not yet.
Okay.
Maybe soon.
But could it be a good paying job and not a side hustle?
When we started in sustainability, there were probably around 300 that were in the corporate field.
In the Philippines?
In the Philippines. Now I think it's more than 1,000. So it's a growing occupation, if you will. And it's not just in let's say NGOs or in business. The PSP now has a sustainability office, and they're also looking. They're the ones actually driving the conversation on greenwashing, simply because there's a circular that says greenwashing is defined like this: banks can be penalized if you're supporting something that has been accused of greenwashing. So. To add to the regulators there, the BSP is getting involved in this conversation as well to ensure the accuracy of the data that the banks would put out, apart from, of course, the mainstream companies.
Yeah, and there's really emerging green jobs available. I was just researching the blue economy and looking into the references out there, realizing that it really spills over across sectors. So sustainability provides a framework that allows you to think systems in a systematic way, in a systems way of thinking, to be able to kind of work interdisciplinary, intersectoral, and to really be able to create efficiencies, actually. So Jonas's very important point was efficiency in business.
Yeah.
Really being able to kind of properly resource allocate, making sure that you have proper programs for well-being for your employees, which leads to better retention, better capacity building. And so, I think companies are recognizing the benefits of sustainability practitioners and also green jobs. Yeah.
We started this conversation by just talking about a community, and then we kind of like ring-fenced companies. Government is another piece.
Mhm.
So it seems that it's really collaboration we're coming down to that makes for an effective conversation on climate change initiatives. So who gets to be the ringleader then? Is there a certain sector in society, or just go and do what you can and then it'll just all come together?
Well, from my experience over the years, there's no single company that is leading really on particular field. I mean, if we look at environmental topics, some standards note that there will be 8 different uh, set of metrics that you need to look at for the environment. No single company in the Philippines is leading in all, but they might be leading in some. For example, in climate change, it's really more of the holdings companies because they have a bigger perspective into all of this. But when it comes to, let's say, efficient use of water, it's really more real estate because they know the situation, or perhaps like people that have worked with agriculture because they know that how precious the resource is. So, but it's not just that. I mean, there's also about 40 topics on social that you can also link to the 8 topics in environmental. So the challenge is how do you bring these things together, and the best way is really through collaboration.
Yeah, I think it might just be really the only way because, I mean, I've seen programs that have succeeded because of leadership from different groups. So
Such as?
you've got LG. So, like, for example, in Palo Leyte, the LGU leads in, of course, they have the funding, they have the vision, the design of being able to, let's say, put up a gastronomy society. And so we've enjoyed celebrating gastronomy events for the past 2 years. There were efforts before that to lead up to this, like, for example, creating cooperatives dedicated to certain craft or certain livelihood, then you see the people and they're attending the workshops and they're really getting interested. They took climate fresque workshops. They learned about aquaculture, and really it's more of like being able to come and have a dialogue. So there are differences. Sometimes we have panels and we bring up questions about like product what about packaging? So we're improving livelihood, and yet we have to use plastic packaging or certain equipment to be able to extend shelf life, which is not really carbon efficient. And so we have those conversations, and we have to negotiate on how to approach this new low carbon economy. And so, yeah, collaboration is definitely the way to go to be able to make sure that everyone has ownership about that strategy, that solution, to have real impact that we can measure later on.
We got about 5 minutes. I'm really curious how being a sustainability practitioner has changed your lives and for the people around you, your friends, your loved ones. Because this is deliberate. It's not just like, I'm living my life because I want it. I'm sure it's a deliberate action on your part every single day that you wake up. That you got to be a sustainable person.
Well, for me, I bring a lot of my stories from the various places that I've been. I'm from Cebu originally. My mother's actually from Misamis Occidental, Mindanao. So whenever we have conversations on, let's say, energy, when Northern Mindanao is one of those places that is enjoying stable energy now, but before. Probably 20 in my high school years, we experienced like rotating brownouts, and we didn't have that idea of stabilizing or ensuring that we get more green energy so that we can have a better life. And then I come to Manila, and we have different problems here.
We have 8-hour brownouts.
So yeah. Bringing those experiences and bringing those stories together, and then bridging that with principles of sustainability and climate action, particularly on climate action, can kind of drive these discussions moving forward, and trying to get them to understand, okay, we really need to solve this. we need to imagine what can be the solution, and it leads to like innovation, collaboration, and actually this conversation with Nisha that I've been having for a while now, actually.
Yeah.
It is, and you consider him your mentor.
Yes, exactly. And I try to introduce them to as many people as I can to learn from the ways of Jonas. But yeah, just to share also, like, it's been really transformative for me. I think it really defines the quality of thought, the quality of life that you have every day. And the more really that you're sustainable, you can live a more healthy life. You can also be in agreement with nature and other people. And it's really quite inspiring to really go down that journey. And I do wish it for a lot more people. It is not the easiest thing, but it truly is rewarding. And hopefully it can be rewarding for more people.
It's a great message for Earth Day. Thank you so much for being with me on this very important
Thank
day.
you for
Nisha.
having us, Cathy.
Appreciate it, Jonas.
Thank you.
And catch us again next Thursday at 9 p.m. Philippine Standard Time on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And if you haven't done so, like or follow my social media pages. I'm Cathy Yang. This is Thought Leaders.